I think to a certain extent, it becomes almost an existential issue for both continents. What is that is going to make us not only to survive a very convoluted global order, but really to be able to thrive? But also this kind of underlying understanding that perhaps it's not Europe or Asia or the US or Latin America that will be the driving force of Africa's future development.
Good morning. We're recording this podcast just ahead of the G20 summit, which is taking place in South Africa in the coming days. Just after that, we'll also have an EU-AU summit, European Union, African Union summit in Luanda, Angola. And all of this is taking place at a time when multilateralism and international cooperation is very much under attack, particularly with the Trump administration's moves of recent months, but also increasingly from some European actors. This is Chloe Teven, and this is Europolis, the Global Europe podcast. Today, I'm joined by Sophie Desmidt, Associate Director at ECDPM, leading our work on peace, security, and international partnerships. Good morning, Sophie.
Good morning, Chloe. Happy to be here.
You interviewed Gustavo de Carvalho, a senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and touched on why the EU-AU partnership matters, on their common interest in multilateralism and what can be gained on both sides through a new and more honest approach to partnership. Why did you think that Gustavo would be a good person to discuss these questions with?
So Gustavo is one of the best analysts on African foreign policy and international relations, including bringing that perspective on peace and security. He's a senior researcher at SAIIA, but I think he brings really a unique and deep perspective on how South Africa and Africa are positioning themselves on the global stage, and bringing also what is underlying that in terms of regional dynamics, having worked on, for example, the African Union and the African Union's role in multilateralism and peace and security for over a decade. Since the last EU-AU summit, the world has changed quite a bit, and there's probably even a higher urgency or need to reform the system if you see the number of conflicts and the level of competition that is taking place at the global scale. And I think there's a sentence from Gustavo at the very end of the podcast that I think captures this well, about Europe and Africa being the adults in the room and actually trying to go against these forces that are trying to undermine the multilateral system, because both regions are actually really in need of having a more functional multilateral peace and security system.
Great. Well, let's dive right in.
Welcome, Gustavo.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You and I are actually in Addis at the moment of recording this. We had our high-level workshop on multilateral peace and security reforms and what role for the EU-AU relationship to this. So we have the EU-AU summit coming up in Luanda. What's the mood like in going into this summit? Is there really a sense that it could be a turning point, a building block, or should we say expectations are more modest than that?
Thanks, Sophie. And I think when we look into the broader context in 2025, we certainly see an international environment where it places Europe in a different environment and a different momentum for its own diversification efforts, for its own roles in Africa, but also for African countries themselves. There is this increasing transactionality that we see coming from the Trump administration, and the tariff wars really put countries into a space to look into who are we engaging with. Certainly between Africa and Europe, there is a historical relation, often with traumatic experiences, but at the end of the day, with very deep engagements, whether we're talking about trade, whether we're talking about investments. And this is very much, I think, where there is an interesting momentum for this EU-AU summit. I think it's going to be a very important testing ground for Global Gateway, where we see as an initiative from the European Union somehow to counter efforts that we've seen from like the Belt and Road Initiative from China, or even initiatives like the United States Lobito Corridor in the same Angola where the summit is gonna happen. There's of course a lot of challenges around this. I think these two continents see themselves as potentially as increasing their interactions and engagements, but there is a lot of sore points too, whether we're talking about views around migration, issues around climate, access to financial markets. All of those issues, I think, become much more important, especially if we're looking to the shifting landscape when it comes to what traditional relations between those two continents have been. Yes, we talk about trade. Yes, we talk about investments, but also that perhaps this third pillar that is often related to development aid, that one we're seeing a major shift, not only in terms of reductions of official development assistance from Europe, but also the very narrative from Africa about what is required for development to be done, that is less about the idea of aid, but much more in terms of access to markets, cost of money, and the ability of actually accessing, having the access to finances in a way that with much lower interest rates, but also in terms of the continent's own ability to attract not only European partners, they are only some of the partners amongst many players that are coming into Africa. So I think all of those will be very much at stake. And I think for Europe will be important to recognize the different momentum, and for Africa to see how Europe can be part of these diversification efforts that we see happening globally.
Yeah. No, and that brings me to a question that I had on how Europe and Africa can navigate today's messy geopolitics. So you have the US, there's China, there's also Russia, there's the BRICS, that is an important format as well for key African partners. The EU sometimes seems to be a bit on the back burner as a partner. Also, Europe has turned a bit more towards itself with a huge security challenge on its footsteps, and really trying to strengthen its own competitiveness, strengthen its own strategic autonomy. But as you say, there's so many factors that call actually for a closer collaboration, just the sheer proximity of both regions. So how can they find common ground in that mix, that messy mix of shifting geopolitics, different multilateral fora, G20, BRICS, the UN, and what should we expect from the summit to kind of find a common footing or a common ground?
I think to a certain extent, it becomes almost an existential issue for both continents. The geographical proximity that you well mentioned, I think it certainly plays a major role, but also the way in which and what are the assumptions that these two continents are perceiving about what is that is going to make us not only to survive a very convoluted global order, but really to be able to thrive. If we're looking to continental narratives and what is really seen as the key driving force within the continent, it is about strengthening the engagements with regions like Europe, but it's fundamentally about how do we reposition Africa within fundamental shifts in global supply chains, trade routes, sectors and markets, but also this kind of underlying understanding that perhaps it's not Europe or Asia or the US or Latin America that will be the driving force of Africa's future development, but very much that acknowledgement that when we have a continent of 1.5 billion people that only trades around 15% of its overall trade, that within itself, so only 15% of trade that Africa does is intra-African. That means that this is the new frontier for Africa itself. But for that to happen, it's required to change economic baselines within the continents. This idea that we need to increase the added value of African economy, that we need to increase the complementarity of African economies, and we need to improve the way in which infrastructure connects rather than divides the continents. And I think that for me is something that Europe should really start considering, that it's not just about a relationship between Europe and Africa as these two very diverse continents, but perhaps to identify these priorities that are set up and what are some of the Europe's comparative advantages. Perhaps Global Gateway, as much as there's this understanding of perhaps trying to counter ideas like global Belt and Road Initiative, or even this kind of Lobito corridor efforts, and all of this spillover effects that has created in Central Africa, but also to look into the sectors in which there is a space of complementarity. We already see, for instance, a really important and really major role that Europe plays in terms of energy transition within the continent. And if we look into the South African case and our own just energy transition process, where Europe is fundamentally central to that, not only in terms of seeing that as this kind of value-based understanding of the importance of leading into a transition, but also that links that directly into economic outputs that are beneficial to Europe, but also beneficial to the continent. That, I think, is perhaps not only a shift in terms of initiatives and approaches, but there is a mindset shift that I think is required from both sides. From an European point of view, it needs to think of what is that we have to offer and what is that we have to gain. But also from an African side, what is that we want from Europe, and how do we push this relationship to become a relationship that adapts to a changing environment, but also to expectations from different parts of the world. And I think in that sense is for us to think about diversification not only as a diversification of partners and of forums and venues that we are interacting with one another, but also diversification of what we have to offer and what we want to receive, both in terms of what Africa can do towards Europe, but also vice versa. That is tricky. And that, I think, this is why I think this summit in Angola is an important test to this new thinking, a new environment in a relationship that is part of a much more complex global environment, but at the same time that perhaps can plant certain seeds in terms of future conversations, discussions that will not all be resolved in Angola in late November, but really that opens different spaces that will not be the same as what we had been seeing in the last 20 or 30 years. And that, I think, it is, the earlier we acknowledge that, the easier the process becomes, because it's simply not the same as what we have seen before.
Yeah. And already, I think you mentioned the Global Gateway. The Global Gateway has an emphasis on infrastructure, which, I mean, based on what you said, would respond very well to Africa's development needs. But sometimes when I think about the Global Gateway and where it comes from, it did come from a relatively traditional international cooperation, and it's really transitioning. I mean, someone said to me recently, they're laying the tracks as the train is already going, which is of course tricky. And if you have a messy geopolitical environment, that makes it quite challenging. So the last AU-EU ministerial confirmed that both the EU and the AU value multilateralism, and in fact, you could say that both regions are really in need of a more effective multilateral system, especially when it comes to security. Several countries and groups of countries are pushing for a stronger or an adaptation of the representation and how these structures are run. There's the G4 initiative, there's the Esowene consensus, and there's support from different EU and AU member states to these different initiatives on paper. But at the same time, and that's what we discussed in our own workshop yesterday, the progress on making those representation reforms a reality are lagging behind. So you and I are not expecting a huge breakthrough at the summit, but what could be something that could be on the agenda, that could be agreed upon at the summit, that could push forward these reforms at a time when the UN system and the peace and security architecture is really in crisis.
But I think you bring really important points, because while I think after Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of the focus on Africa-Europe relations was about what divided us. It was how we saw aspects of the global order differently. The Trump administration doesn't change that, but it certainly fast-tracks a sense in both continents of what brings us together, and is this intrinsic understanding that exists within Europe and that exists within Africa, that alone we have very little to be able to influence global issues, and working collaboratively within our regions and within multilateral spaces that allows us not only to pool resources, to bring common ideas, but really to make this idea of interdependence something much more complete. And I think that is an opportunity for both continents, that perhaps is not about major announcements. I'm not someone that believes on this idea that events are transformative. Processes are. And I think to a certain extent there is a narrative that can be presented that is not simply about, because I think what we discussed yesterday in our workshop is this idea that we often talk about Europe-Africa relations almost as the role of Europe in Africa, rather than about their relations on how they see the world. The moment now when we see fundamentally things that we find important, that is to strengthen those institutions, because we benefited, both Africa and Europe, when we had stronger institutions that were able to engage with, that we were able to foster new spaces for consensus and really to identify how we can be stronger through these processes. That for me is perhaps what I think it could be really a powerful message that can come from Angola. Because in that meeting, if we showcase that these both continents see multilateralism as the only and most effective avenue for ensuring that the fragmented global order does not derail into a fully fledged international instability, that I think is something that both can really operate and can really take into the advantages of both continents. Because while independently or even together strengthening multilateralism is not only going to depend on Europe and Africa, there is no way that these two continents will not be involved in whatever comes either next or whatever is come to strengthen this aspect. And I think also these are two continents that really understood how regionalism can be an important tool around that. The European Union and the African Union, despite being very different in terms of how they operate, what are their own values, principles, they often have complementary ones, but they both kind of come from the same understanding that the European project that starts with this very small, with very specific aspects around economic interdependence within specific parts of Europe, but really to transform the way in which the continent sees itself internally, but how it positions externally. But it's also, we can see an interesting parallel about how does African countries see the value of its own institutions as a key conduit for the new place that Africa pursues to have in the world. And understanding those, despite that they're not mirrors to one another. It's not that the African Union is necessarily a mirror to what happened in Europe, but certainly it shows there is different ways in which multilateralism can be fostered. And I think both continents have a lot to offer in that regard, both in terms of what worked, but even about what did not work and what still needs to be pursued. And we can bring as two continents influential voices, not only in terms of our own regions, but also to help spread certain ideas and socialize certain ideas in different parts of the world, including those parts of the world that are much more reluctant of strengthening multilateral institutions at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking while you were talking about how far actually the relationship and the partnership has evolved. I mean, there was the African Peace Facility, which had actually quite a systematic engagement of European and African partners, but in a very unbalanced way. And I mean, it was about, like you said, how can Europe basically finance peace and security responses in Africa? And yes, it tried to adhere to the frameworks, for example, silencing the guns, etc. Then there was the European Peace Facility, but again, it's a European instrument. It broadened the scope of reach. It was not just Africa, but it's with that there was kind of there was no longer a systematic European-African dialogue even on security. And I think a real game changer would be if Africa could discuss with Europe, for example, responses to the situation in Ukraine. What could Africa's role be in the bilateral relationship between two regions, but also at the UN level? What will happen after the war is over? What will happen with the ceasefire? I mean, it might sound a bit wild at the moment, but at the same time, I think that would really shift the balance to the equal partnership that on paper both continents are really looking for.
I think it's a fundamental point, because if we look into the lessons from the African Peace Facility and the European Peace Facility, you're absolutely right. I think there was certainly that understanding within the African continent that the capability that Africa had, and to a large degree still has, in terms of financing many of the responses to instability within Africa required that it developed those kinds of interactions and partnerships that often led to a lot of concerns around the over-reliance in terms of external funding to its own initiatives, but also what a lot of people here in Addis Ababa often talk about, the implicit or explicit ideas of strategic conditionalities that come from that really reduces the ability of the continent to promote its own agency and being the driving force. And I think that is precisely, where institutions like the United Nations should come in. I think you and I are quite familiar with the idea of Resolution 2719. That is that resolution that was approved 2 years ago by the UN Security Council that talks about the predictability and sustainability of financing of peace and security initiatives in Africa, and particularly those led by the African Union. And I think that is often misunderstood, because it's often presented as almost as the African continent begging the international community for financing, but much rather as a space in which, if the Security Council, which is the ultimate peace and security body under the UN Charter that we all subscribe to, says that issues in the DRC or in Somalia or in Sudan are not local or regional threats to peace and security. They are considered by legally binding resolutions of the United Nations Security Council as threats to international peace and security. And that understanding that there is a responsibility enshrined within the UN Charter that the international community should be responding to that. I think that allows, for me, to a large degree, to ensure that there is a mutual commitment in terms of the international community, but also in terms of this idea of the commitment gap, that some countries are financing responses and the other countries are actually the kind of at the forefront of implementing them. So I think this is one aspect, and will remain incredibly difficult. Even though it's been 2 years, we're still not anywhere near of that resolution being taken in terms of the tangible effects. So I think this is one point. I think another point is perhaps that while I think this idea of transactionality within the global order at the moment is very worrying, there is perhaps one element that can be potentially positive, that there is, instead of necessarily looking into this idea of self-interest as necessarily cynical, that allows open conversations. So this is what we actually want as Europe, because we find is either existential to our region. This is what we find that is important for us to reduce the risks that exists in a global order, but same from the African side. And I think the Ukrainian situation, I think it's fundamentally that, because when we look into what happened in Europe after Russia invaded Ukraine is that for Europe, and rightfully so, that is an existential threat. Yeah. It's perceived as one, is right at your footsteps, while for most of African countries, this is perceived often as a regional conflict that has global implications, but is not fundamentally existential to the life and the economy. So it's much less about like that narrative that was very common in 2022, that Africa was split, many countries became so pro-Russian. I don't think that was really, I think often that missed the point. Yeah. There was an understanding that's like, we're not so sure how influential we are in this sense. And I do think there is a possibility of that. And I'll talk a little bit about this. But this is something that brings multiple calculations that is not simply about our relationship with Europe, but also our own ability of navigating global spaces where we look into ourselves already from a point of fragility. Now, what could Africa do? And I think it's fundamentally one of the narratives that in the first perhaps 2 years of the war was very much criticized on the idea of dialogue, of bridging spaces and so on. But right now, far less problematic in the sense of when we have the African Peace Initiative that goes to Kyiv and St. Petersburg in mid-2023, not to present a peace plan. I think this is another of the misconceptions about that, because there was often presented as Africa bringing a plan. If we're looking to those 10 points that were presented to the two states, they were very much like position papers, that we believe that the territorial integrity of countries should not be breached, that we believe that the issues around prisoners of wars and the abducted children should be resolved, that the issues related to food security. But what we can then see the role of not only of African countries, but global South countries at large, is that often these are the very few countries that are able to still engage with both sides, and whether we like it or not. And I think coming from South Africa, where the idea of dialogue is not perceived as just a naive idea, is very much entrenched within the very history of the country. Because when we hear like, well, we do not trust the Russians and we not trust what they would do, often the answer that I see in South Africa is like, well, but neither did we trust the National Party when we started negotiating towards the end of the apartheid regime. This is a process that perhaps we are not so clear when dialogue starts or what the final outcome would be, but it needs to start somewhere, unless we believe that we can win in the battlefield, which seems at this stage much more difficult to achieve from either side in that space. Yep. So I think that is perhaps something that African countries could provide. That is not like a naive sense of like, let's just talk and like make everything happier and so on, but really to provide channels of understanding what are the grievances that different sides has, and is there any kinds of solutions that we can start brewing that perhaps are acceptable to not only to the two sides of the particular war, Russia and Ukraine, but also to the multitude of players and actors that are directly or indirectly involved into that. So in that sense, that this geographical distance that African countries have, while initially was perceived by many African countries as almost as an opportunity of disengagement, of leave us out of this and we really don't know how to deal with this. It wasn't about Europe losing Africa, but Africa almost choosing itself and identifying what it could do and how much, what are the different pros and cons and damages that it could occur. Right now, I think that can be seen as an asset, because that distance in itself means that a lot of the charged views around that, those could be potentially done. But once again, these are not events. We're not going to have one day that suddenly all of us will be happy and living peacefully, but much more of try and errors, testing new things, and really looking into what solutions and options we can actually start exploring with.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I just got an email this morning from a colleague. She shared an opinion piece from a Chinese scholar suggesting that there could be a role for BRICS countries in a possible multinational force in Ukraine. Of course, I don't think Europe will accept Russian, she was talking about South Africa and Brazil and India. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. The other thing that you made me think of when you were talking is about this keeping channels open, is about this doctrine that it existed during the Cold War within NATO, which was actually conceptualized by a Belgian foreign minister, which is the Harmel Doctrine, which is both about deterrence and détente. So basically keeping diplomatic channels open, but building up deterrence. And I think that's very much the situation where Europe is in now. We just had drone sightings over Brussels airport. I mean, at least in my home country, Belgium, Russian hybrid attacks are high at the agenda. So I very much agree with you. And it was also something that we said in the workshop yesterday. Summit is important, but it will be much more important to actually build or rebuild a partnership. Also in our interviews, a lot of interlocutors said, we don't really talk to another. We don't at the technical level. There's no exchanges that are worth mentioning, really. There's high-level summits, there's consultative meetings, annual consultative. These are important, and apparently they are constructive, which is positive. But it's really about investing human capital, diplomatic exchange at the technical level to build that relationship. So I think, maybe one final question, looking ahead at the summit. And if we would record this podcast in, say, 2 or 5 years, what would be your hope or sort of your expectation on how the peace and security partnership between Europe and Africa would have changed? And what would success of that partnership kind of look like? It's a very tough question. Sorry for that one.
No, I think it's a great question because it allows me to do a lot of wishful thinking and perhaps trying to bring that back to reality. But I think there's when we talk about a global order being a space of almost a battle of narratives at times, I think this for me can be a starting point of looking into one another slightly different. That is perceived as far less top-down, that is acknowledging that there is issues in the relationships. And I think to a certain extent that is positive. Because if your relationship is so superficial with one another that there is not really a lot at stake, whatever it's said, it sticks because we don't really trade with one another, we're far away. But because there is depth, there is complexity in Europe and Africa's relation. There is historical complexity, there is economic complexity, there is social, there is political, there is interests, there is external players that are different, that are outside of both Europe and Africa that needs to be done. And I think that for me, a thing that provides an interesting space for perhaps not suddenly bring this magic bullet that it's going to make the two continents suddenly completely change how they interact or perceive one another. But really to understand that there is steps that can be taken towards ensuring that this new momentum of international fragmentation can be positively taken as an opportunity by the two continents in terms of because often when we look into narratives of many European states, if I were to take their names out, they don't sound that different to what I hear in places like Pretoria, Brasilia, Jakarta, and so on. There is a strong sense that the global order is fragmented, and that leads to the global order being risky. So we diversify partners because we want to reduce our exposure to risk. And if we start seeing one another, it's unlikely that this a reduction of risk will happen just between Europe and Africa. It will happen between Europe and Asia. We've just seen the Asian summit, and I've never seen an Asian summit where you have pretty much every big global leader being there, because we're all looking into different parts of the world, and particularly those with interesting prospects and opportunities of interaction. I think the EU-Africa summits now in late November can be an interesting example of that, because it can impact not only this relationship between two continents, but also provide ideas, tests, potential initiatives that can become models and ideas on perhaps on how, not only on how Europe and Latin America, but also Africa and Latin America, Africa and Asia Europe and Asia. And I think that understanding of complexity within a sense, only players like ours that have that depth with all of its problems and with all of its gains, this I think is what we can really perhaps use as an opportunity to really shape what type of narrative we want to present, what kind of honest conversation we want to have one another, even if they mean really hard truths being told to one another about limitations, about challenges, concerns, anger, frustrations, traumas. All of those are part of it, and they're not going to change overnight. But there is the idea of, perhaps as a closing thought from my side, is the idea that I do think that Europe and Africa can be the adults in the room, where a lot of the world is not really playing in that sense, and a really as a wishful thinking, but a mix of hope and perhaps there is elements that could indicate that this could happen, that maybe Angola would be the first step towards that.
Yeah, great. That's fantastic, Gustavo. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, and looking forward to continue working with you.
Thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure and always great working with you guys.
I found that interview very interesting in that Gustavo points both to the material aspects of the relationship and also to the framing of the relationship and the space for meaningful dialogue. He seems to suggest that there's a growing convergence in terms of the material aspects of the relationship, with the switch to a focus on industrialization and investments and a move away from aid, and seems to suggest that the Global Gateway and what it hopes to achieve is very much in line with African aspirations. This is something that we will delve into in more detail in future episodes. But right now, I wanted to maybe touch again on the point that he makes about how we often talk about Europe-Africa relations as if it's about Europe's role in Africa rather than how they each see the world and how they can work together. So the current moment offers a lot of opportunity on this front to kind of reconsider the relationship, to think anew about how we do dialogue and what are the space for commonalities. Following on from this, what are your hopes in terms of kind of developing this kind of truly open dialogue between the EU and the AU? With the summit, but also beyond.
I think that last point, Chloe, is exactly what we also thought about when we had the interview and the discussions and the exchanges in Addis as well. It's not something new, but I think, the fact that this summit takes place is really important, and they are an important moment to come together and, literally put things on paper and sort of have an agreement, despite all of the frustration and sort of the hesitance in going into this. There's a lot of important and good work that is being put into this by policymakers and officials on both sides. And I think at the time, the current state of world affairs for both regions, I think it's an important moment. But when we spoke to people and had those conversations in Addis and beyond and before that, there was something missing in the sense that people felt that there was no actual technical level relationship on peace and security. And I think in that sense, the answer is probably going to be a bit less exciting than the results that both sides could gain from it. The fact is that the world is kind of on fire in terms of peace and security issues. I think in the last 5 years, conflicts have doubled globally. Europe also has a conflict on its doorstep. In Africa, we're also seeing a rise in violent conflicts. But at the same time, both sides have very matching stated objectives on what they want from a multilateral peace and security issue. So what's the missing piece of the puzzle? And I think I really liked what Gustavo said on Africa and Europe being the adults in the room, because I think they can really bring in a joint kind of axis of pro-multilateralism and going against this chaos and division that other international actors and permanent members of the Security Council are sowing. And I think for me, one huge game changer would be that the partnership between Europe and Africa is a discussion of global peace and security issues, not just what you said exactly, what Europe can do in Africa. I think that should still remain a huge issue. But for example, if you look at the outcome, the communique of the last joint consultative meeting between both African AU and EU security councils, Ukraine is mentioned once, the occupied territories are mentioned once, and then the rest is about conflicts in Africa. And I think if both sides could kind of take their relationship as sort of a footing where both can discuss what's important for Europe in terms of peace and security, what's important for Africa in terms of peace and security, I think it would change the narrative quite a bit. And what's funny is that in our conversations in the project that we're doing with Gustavo, a lot of people are looking at the reform processes on debt, on economic global governance issues, and trying to see how those processes can also feed into a better and changing narrative on peace and security, where it would be much less about how Europe can fund African peace and security operations, but how both regions can work together to have sort of joint objectives and what they want to achieve. So I think, I don't know if it will happen at the summit, but the summit can be a good moment to put some things in motion and to agree on certain smaller steps to achieve that as well. More technical level cooperation, pushing forward some of the reforms at the UN level on working methods, on representation. And I think if they could both do that after the summit, during the summit, after the summit, we could make a good step forward on making the global multilateral peace and security system a bit more functional and a bit more effective.
This is really interesting. Like basically, and I think this is something that at ECDPM across the board, we've been saying again and again, the summit can be an interesting and an important moment to touch on some of the essential issues of the day and to put things in motion. But ultimately, if this relationship, if this partnership is to actually be meaningful, there need to be ongoing technical processes and room for ongoing dialogue in place. I hope to discuss this with you and with others again in the coming weeks. For now, thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you to Gustavo for the interview.
With pleasure. Thank you, Chloe, for having me.
Goodbye.